That sucks.
Hello, and welcome to the 25th anniversary edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. We remind ourselves that we are running this festival as climate catastrophes multiply and intensify, when over 6 million people worldwide have died from COVID, and when the people of Ukraine are fighting the brutal Russian invasion and war. For all of us at FLEF, the world is our why. I am Rachel Geary, assistant producer of FLEF. Major sponsors of FLEF include the Park Foundation and Ithaca College, as well as the Park Center for Independent Media. Our festival theme this year is entanglements, a concept that explores how different environments, ideas, imaginaries, places, politics, practices, registers, and species twist into each other and enmesh. We are all very honored that you have joined us today for this vitally important and timely session, Strikes and Resignations. We kindly ask you to rename yourself by adding your location. It is with great pleasure that I now introduce you to today's moderator, Shaianne Oesterreich, Associate Professor of Economics at Ithaca College.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks to the whole FLEF team and Director Patty Zimmerman for having us. I'm really excited for tonight. We're here right in the middle of FLEF. There's a lot to do and see and watch, and we're just excited to be part of it. So over the course of the last couple of years, especially in the last year or so, everyone has seen signs from restaurants and stores asking us to be patient, that they're having a worker shortage and nobody wants to work. This so-called Great Resignation is also something that we hear a lot about. And we're wondering, are workers really in a better position to take a stand because they just can't take the bad conditions? Is there something specific about COVID that is creating this environment? Also, I know my social media is telling me more and more about union activity, from John Deere to Starbucks, REI, teachers unions. We see that some workers are in a position to ask for more. And some of this is about health and safety related to COVID. Some of it is about wages, retirement, health insurance, better contracts, less precarity. So we're here tonight to ask about whether some of these big things are really happening. Is labor really having a moment? Are things really changing? And if there are some changes, are there structural changes? Are they temporary? And also, are they equitable? Are Black and brown workers able to make some of these gains? Is some of this union activity exclusionary, or does it provide opportunity for all more union organizing?
Cheyenne, you temporarily muted, but you're back.
Yeah, it just came on. I don't know how that happened. I'll just repeat the last thing I was saying. So, one of our big questions is, if we're seeing some big change, is it a change that is equitably distributed? Are workers in all sectors? How do our care obligations fit into the working landscape? So we're really excited to talk with our guests. And I'm really grateful that my old friend, Kate Bahn, and my new friend, Jason Tomlinson, have agreed to join us tonight. We're sad to say that John Moyer, the IC alum, longtime cameraman, camera operator, and filmmakers union member, IATSE member, will not be able to join us tonight because he is on a shoot, but that the upside of that is that gives us more time to get into more detail. So first, I want to introduce Kate Bahn, and who's recently promoted to Chief Economist at the Center for Equitable Growth. So congratulations, Kate. And can you just tell us a little bit about the center, about what you do there, and how you got there?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me here. It's really a treat to be talking to a new audience, and I've never spoken at a film festival before. It's not usually where economists are talking, so it's really nice to be here. So I work at an organization called the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which is a research and grant-making organization based in Washington, D.C. that investigates the causes and consequences of economic inequality. And so what we are trying to do is bringing sort of the best, most cutting-edge research from economics and other social science fields to bear on public policy debates, to sort of refute this notion that having an equitable society is at odds with having a growing economy. And so we're trying to demonstrate that having equity, that attacking economic inequality through public policy is actually good for the economy, makes the economy function better. So that's the role of my organization. And my background is as a labor economist and doing research on labor. So part of why I'm here. And so I do a lot of research on how power in the labor market determines outcomes of workers. So that's sort of the background of my research area. And I got to doing research on this also through a background working in the labor movement prior to going to grad school and through grad school. So that is my background and where I am now.
Great, thanks. And Jason, just like Kate, the detailed bio information is in the chat, but can you tell us a little bit about Jobs with Justice, and also about the special initiative that you work on, and maybe also a little bit about what you were doing before you started with Jobs with Justice?
Sure. Like I said, my name is Jason Tomlinson. I work with Jobs with Justice. I have been with Jobs with Justice for nearly 2 years now. Jobs with Justice primarily works with kind of in that intersection between labor and community justice. We work on creating more equitable for workers' rights and creating opportunities for workers, as well as feeding the community and being able to work on policies and legislation that helps uplift the community. I work specifically, I'm the coordinator for Jobs with Justice for the Advancing Black Strategy Initiative, as well as the Labor Research and Action Network. And I'll talk a little bit more about ABSI or ABSI. And that was an initiative that was started with the intent to create equity and create opportunity for Black workers. It's a joint project that we're working together along with the Black Worker Initiative at the Institute for Policy Studies, as well as Morehouse College. And its overarching vision is to create a cohort of Black economic justice and labor-focused strategists committed to leading, developing, and advancing progressive policies. And also to be able to develop campaigns that support the collective power building of working people. We believe the best way to do that is through the South, because we feel like the greatest change and the greatest density of Black workers is there in the South. Before that, I can talk a little more about ABSI later, but before that, working with JWJ, I worked with the local coalition here in Dallas, Texas. I worked with the Dallas AFL-CIO as well as Texas New Air Center, which is the JWJ coalition here. I worked on a program called Project Phoenix, where we help those who are kind of just getting involved or just entering the criminal justice system. We help them get union jobs. We worked heavily with the probation department and the courts, as well as unions, and we identify individuals who are first-time nonviolent felony offenders or misdemeanor offenders usually on probation, and we help them get resources to get identification, get housing, get vital records, as well as careers, not just employment. And so we felt like that change will be able to take individuals from on a pathway into the prison system to be able to make decisions and build a community and get the support from unions to be able to provide for their families.
That's amazing and really important work. All right, I'm going to get down to some of the questions that I have for you two. And some are more directed at one than the other, but I think there will be some opportunity for full conversation. So the first thing I want to ask to Kate is, what are we actually seeing about strikes? What is the research saying about strikes and collective action these days?
So over the long term, so probably the past 40 years or so, strikes have been declining. Starting in the 1980s, I think is when we started to see a really precipitous decline. And there's a number of reasons for that. I can go into that very briefly. I would say, the really one emblematic example of this is a strike in 1981, the Patco Strike, when President Reagan sent in replacement workers. And so one reason strikes have declined in effectiveness and likelihood of taking place is the willingness to use replacement workers, which was not sort of a norm prior to that. There's just a general more hostile environment towards unions from business sides. And then obviously a lower union density makes striking harder because it is harder to engage in a strike if you don't have access to union resources like a strike fund and coordinators to engage in a strike. But it is really, I think, also important to keep in mind it's part of a really long-term trend. Labor law changed with the Taft-Hartley Act in, I forget exactly when, 1947 or 1957, I can check up on the number later, but labor law adjusted sort of following the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the initial protection for the right to strike. There was modifications to the right to strike with the Taft-Hartley Act, which made it, for example, you can't strike, you can't do a secondary boycott, and so you can't strike against a non-direct employer. And it was a little bit prescient to see that our labor market has changed so much since then that we now have really complicated employment relationships sometimes. So for example, I worked for a janitorial services union in New York City, but they were working in buildings that were owned by a real estate company. So they could not technically be striking, or they cannot be sort of picketing and boycotting outside the building because the building was owned by a different party than who their employer was. So some of these complicated employment relationships based on this law from the 1950s made it harder to engage in strike activities. And that really led to sort of a decline from the 70s and really precipitously since the 1980s. That being said, I think people know that more recently there's been a lot more strike activity. Really emblematic of this is the Red for Ed movement, which is really exciting. Particularly the Red for Ed movement is an example of what's called a Wildcat Strike, which is a strike that is done without technically having those protections provided by the Fair Labor Standards Act, but they're still just withdrawing their labor without those protections. So it's pretty bold of the workers to do that. And with these movements too, what happened in these strikes beginning in 2019 with the Red for Ed movement is they sort of started this snowball effect of people becoming more friendly and amenable to the idea of striking workers. And so research shows, for example, that families who are directly impacted by the Red for Ed strike, and so that they're comparing families maybe of 5 and 6 year olds who lost their kindergarten teacher and had to figure out childcare to families with 3 and 4 year olds who weren't impacted directly by the strike, but otherwise we can presume those are pretty similar families. The folks who actually have directly engaged with strikes or experienced the impact of a strike actually are more sympathetic to strikes. People are becoming more sympathetic when they know what strikes are, when they're able to talk to striking workers and understand what their demands are. And not only are they more supportive of those workers who are striking, but they also are say that they're considering striking themselves at work. Like they are more like, once they know what a strike is, they are more interested in striking themselves as well. So that's sort of long-term decline, but some more recent energy in the past 3 years.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that, where I think when I think of my students, have they ever even talked to a real life union member or that they know of, right? And so getting in the proximity is really fascinating, to think that the proximity to union activity and mobilization is itself like a catalyst. Yeah. And also, so in addition to strikes, is it real that we're seeing more union activity, or are there sort of like media pop-ups that are giving us that impression?
It's a little bit mixed, which is unfortunate. In the last year, so I think with 2020 data, the proportion of workers in a union actually declined a little bit. It's hovering around 10% right now, and it's not increasing as much as we might think, given the media reports of an increase in union activity. And that I think is partly because it's striking and engaging in collective action is a really important tool, but actually unionizing and getting a collective bargaining agreement is like a second step that is really difficult, particularly with an understaffed National Labor Relations Board, which is the body that oversees unfair labor claims and things like that. And so there's a lot of sort of, I'm sure that Jason knows a lot about this too and can speak to this a lot. There's a lot of barriers to actually getting a collective bargaining agreement and being a union member, even if you're engaging in collective action. So like that was the one thing about the Red for Ed movement. It's a great example of workers exercising their power, but they were workers who did not have access to those institutionalized supports for getting unionized and making demands. What they were really doing there was using their collective action and their collective power to make policy demands through the legislative process and the budgeting process. So it's a little bit different, and maybe it's probably too technical, or we can get into it later. So the difference between getting a collective bargaining agreement and then just making demands as workers.
Right. So Jason, what are you seeing from your view in terms of challenges for Black folks and unionizing, which seems to necessitate this initiative that you're a part of?
I mean, it's a consistent thing, you know, from W.B. Du Bois to A. Philip Randolph. Black workers have always had the need to be directly involved and legally protected from harsh impacts of capitalism, which is what really this fight is really about. And then, even despite all of that, you know, union density rate, Blacks maintain the higher rate of, you know, the highest rate of union membership in the country. But it's difficult because they also hold more of these so-called like essential workers or frontline workers. You know, about 1 in 9 workers are Black, but they represent 11.9% of the workplace, and this is according to EPI. And they're 1 in 6 of them are all frontline industry workers. That's including grocery store, convenience store, drug stores, public transit, trucking, warehouse, postal services, healthcare. And so these are jobs that definitely are critical, but also usually they're not as high paying. They're also like kind of the lifeblood of that family. And so there's the real need they need this job, and they're facing the barriers that that Kate just mentioned about misinformation. You know, again, you know, threatened. They have these captive audiences. They're being fed these certain things, and so there's not a lot of options put in front of them. And so we feel like there's a narrative battle that's really at play of being able to really define what is a good working job, what does workers' rights mean. This is education that's not really portrayed in our education as you grow up through K through 12, especially in the South. I'm located here. That's not an education that's really being given over, and so that's probably the first place to start, is really getting the correct information out there, so people know, okay, what a union is. I mean, it's terrible, but I know I didn't really understand what a union was till I was in my 20s. And so that is kind of really some of the big barriers there that needs to be overcome.
So what are some elements of your program in terms of educating, supporting, advocating that seem to be working? And are there certain sectors in the South, like industrial sectors or retail sectors, where you're focusing more?
Yeah, so our program, ABSI, really seeks to connect with unions, more simply, building trades, but unions are more broadly in the South. And we are using existing relationships that we have to be able to take members who are kind of worker leaders who are starting out in their careers and to educate them in what is workers' rights. I mean, so basically it's a new school of thought, as our executive director likes to say. And the program is specifically working, with our Atlanta University Consortium partners like Morehouse and Spelman. We starting a labor studies program that educates on history of organizing, organizing in the 21st century, race, gender, and labor. And we're really trying to, in like a better word, indoctrinate them into a new way of thinking about what actually does it mean to, what is your rights, or how do you organize, how do you build up working Black families. And so the sectors, we've been working heavily with unions like the painters, with the steel workers in South Carolina. We started a fellowship program, actually that's just launched a couple weeks ago, where we took 5 individuals kind of various backgrounds, some more educational, some heavily in unions, and they're going to be in a 15-month program where they're taking classes at Morehouse and Spelman, will also be placed on different campaigns across the South, where they'll get really experience in strategy, because we identified that there is this lack of leadership, specifically Black leadership in labor, and it's rough because there's less Black leaders because they lack the experience, but then they lack the experience because they're on hired in leadership positions. And so we really seek to address that through ABSI and through this fellowship, by giving them the experience and being able to know how to build strategy, how to not just to block walk, but also to develop, pick targets and choose how do you leverage power and those kind of things. We are also building a broader network of Black strategists, that we are connecting through ABSI, where those who in different levels who might already hold leadership positions, or who are just working out, or just maybe who are academics in labor studies, and connected them to be able to coordinate their efforts on research projects, on promoting different campaigns, or political or otherwise. We're hoping to influence not just labor, but also different fields like law and medicine, and academia. And so through our education and through this broad and reach, we hope to be able to kind of raise the school of thought and through the ranks.
Definitely seems like, I don't know, to be cliche about it, that it really takes all sides, right? It takes it takes a sort of a historical mindset. It takes a sort of applied organizational skills and mindset, and access to both of those things, is really can be really difficult. So it sounds really great to to bring together sites like Morehouse, and also these organizations like JWJ.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Kate, what do you see, and Jason too, if you have comments too, is what do we see concerning the policy climate for collective action and unionization? I mean, you were mentioning, Kate, that there's a lot of rules and laws that seem to be like on the side of the bosses and less on the side of even the ability to the protection or the attempt to collectively organize. So what are we seeing there?
Yeah, sure. And also just to like touch a little bit on what you were saying after Jason spoke too about like you have to be at all these different vantage points. And this is sort of what my organization tries to do is like, we don't think we are by ourselves going to change the world at all, but we are like a very small piece of this ecosphere of this world trying to advance economic justice broadly. And so what we are trying to do is sort of change the narrative that policymakers and legislators on how they understand how the economy works so that they will support different policies that would help workers. So that is sort of what we are trying to do, at least because they do rely on a lot of academic narratives to inform how they talk about this. And like Jason may see some of this too when you're talking with community organizers, sometimes they are still relying on these sort of debunked economic narratives based on like economic research does not support a lot of the narratives people support. People say things like minimum wage is going to lose jobs. Like actually the research shows that the minimum wage doesn't lead to the loss of jobs. So sometimes we need to bring good research to bear so that people realize there's a broader expanse of policies that are possible. That being said, it is still pretty tricky right now. I think a lot of people are really aware at the federal level, it is really hard to pass legislation right now. If people have been following those efforts. So, there's a Protecting the Right to Organize Act has been reintroduced for at least 5 years, which would be new legislation that would help workers organize more easily. That has, probably not likely going to be passed anytime soon, but it is still, keeping the beat and on that, trying to expand the ability of workers to organize. But there are other things to do in absence of overhauling these rules that oversee how we currently allow workers and protect workers to organize. There are still ways we can try to improve it. And so a couple of things that would help right now is, again, the National Labor Relations Board does not really enforce a lot of the labor law that is on the books, partly, lack of will, partly lack of funding. It is hard to go after some of these if you're getting a mass of people coming in with unfair labor practices claims, and the board right now does not have the full slate of members who would oversee these cases. It's hard for them to do that. So it's just staffing up the agencies we have, funding the agencies we have. You could also increase the penalties for employers who violate workers' rights on the job. So there's research that shows things like employers know that it is illegal to fire a worker for organizing, but they also know all they're going to have to pay is their back pay. That is not really a huge deterrent. It's not a lot of money to lose. It's just, having to pay a worker when they didn't work, but you're not paying anything above and beyond that. And so it seems as though employers are making a pretty rational choice to violate people's rights on the job when they're trying to organize. And you could just increase those penalties, and that would maybe be an easier strategy to take. And I do think that there is a bit more support for some small measures like that. There's also, policies are trying to be introduced by the Department of Labor to go after things like wage theft. That is when workers are paid less than the minimum wage, or otherwise their wages are stolen. And so there's policies to go after wage theft through things like strategic enforcement. And that would be working with partners like unions and community organizing groups and worker centers like Black worker centers to help find those places where workers' rights are being violated and use these community partners to bring charges to the Department of Labor. And so those are some sort of ways that we can make the institutions we have now function better, while we still, try to keep up pressure on overhauling labor law broadly.
Yeah, this issue, and as Kate knows, I haven't introduced, I work on more international related matters and labor rights and gender in particular. And in most countries, the enforcement of labor law is, one of the most difficult things. I mean, it requires a skilled set of civil servants, of public sector workers to be in charge and to be able to engage in, work on that topic. And that can be really difficult, especially, in eras where public sector workers themselves are, have trouble. Jason, do you see some of that way in which the like policy landscape and the legal environment as some of the barriers for the communities you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of to piggyback off some of the things that Kate mentioned. Even with those violations, and even in the long shot that the company is penalized, have paid back pay. I mean, the damage is kind of already done with the. It costs them less in just the message that's sent by the worker that's fired, and the message that's sent to the rest of the existing workers that even paying the back pay is really not enough. And so, like Kate mentioned, that the punishments need to be stronger, because if you win the battle before the battle is even fought, just because just by firing a worker and paying back pay, then they ultimately win. So there's that. You also see some of these things, especially with the most recent Amazon organizing campaign with RWDSU. Some of the violations there it's kind of, when you hear about it, it's outstanding. You kind of look at it like, how can you win? When you control the ballots, you control, the messaging, you can bring in people to talk to the workers, you control the narrative. You're really, there's not much option there. It's not the opportunity for you to actually speak to the workers. And it's really, so much there. With the monitoring through using technology that Amazon does with their workers, you have the tracking, you have there's so many barriers to really list. There's definitely a change that's necessary. Also when Kate mentioned about the importance of research, I want to definitely to agree to that too, as well as research that really identifies or reflects their population, accurately. That is not taking a segment of certain minority groups and using that to represent the whole. Research should reflect the broad, the full dichotomy that groups really encompass. And so yes, it's definitely something that I've seen and witnessed, and we're trying to address.
So I'm wondering, based on what you guys are saying, is like, what are we seeing some areas where there is some optimism about how labor is doing, how workers are able to negotiate? We have this idea that we have a so-called Great Resignation, and is this, people often, when we say that, people are often thinking, oh, workers are finally in a position to say, I've had it. I have the power to go do something else that's better and for which I will be better respected. Is this like something, is this a real thing that's really happening?
I call it like the great churn or the great reshuffling or something like that. So I can talk about the federal data, and then Jason, you should chime in with sort of real experiences of people who are actually quitting their jobs and thinking about these things, because data just came out today on it's called the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey. It's released every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the quit rate was 2.8%. So 2.8% of workers quit last month, or 2 months ago, because the data is staggered by 2 months, which is actually a really historically high amount of workers to be quitting. So workers are quitting their jobs, but the interesting thing that we're also seeing is that workers are being hired just as much as well. That hires are actually outpacing quits in every single industry. So workers are being really hired a lot. And that's why it's the great churn, the great reshuffling. Workers are just moving around a lot more than they used to be. And I think this is sort of the critical piece of workers being able to exercise their power to withdraw their labor is some of what Jason described before, that like if your income is the backbone of your family, or if you are facing other constraints, it is really hard for you to leave a job just because it's a bad job. But if hires are outpacing quits right now, if we're hiring more workers than workers are leaving their jobs, that actually maybe we're in a current moment, however brief it may be, that it is a little bit easier for a worker to withdraw their labor because they can be a little bit more confident that they'll be able to find another job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I definitely want to echo that. Also, I mean, kind of, you know, with this in this COVID time, and really with us, we have the ability, a lot of us, not all of us, a lot of us have the ability to live at work instead of not working from home. We're truly like living from work. But that kind of scenario has really forced individuals to organize differently, to look at how they're going to reach other people, how they're going to reach workers, to re-strategize their methods, which I feel like it's promising. You know, time will tell whether the movement is successful in really in pivoting to reach workers a different way. But the one thing that is clear, that the previous strategies weren't really working, or at least wasn't effective enough to be able to create the change we want. So I feel like that is promising. I feel like too, with this like kind of this virtual world, we're also forced to, I guess, seek out different partnerships and be able to work with other people in a different way. Like I'm able to join this thing from Dallas, Texas. You know, we were talking about before this call that, you know, having the benefits of this being virtual, that, you know, we're able to commune with each other across the country. And so I think that's the opportunity to collaborate in many ways, that you know, you're able, like Kate mentioned, to, you know, reshuffle and work different jobs, or even work multiple jobs if you choose. But you give yourself some flexibility, the ability to be able to do things that you may not be able to do, you know, in the past. Now, that's, I don't know, that's all great, because now, you know, you're working more times, you're facing in the screen, you know, your back hurt, your eyes hurt, you're sitting there doing work. But it forces us to reevaluate what work looks like. And I think that creates an opportunity for change.
And I think it's a combination of people are reevaluating what work is in their lives and what kind of work they want to be doing in a time when employers have to compete for workers too. So it's kind of like there's been a pent up demand for better lives and better jobs for a long time, but it was hard to actually make that happen. And so I'm like, what I'm hoping, my optimistic note is that, like, in this current moment, if a worker does want to be maybe piecing together a couple different remote jobs, or they want to work, you know, maybe a couple days at home and a couple days from the office, that they finally have the ability to negotiate for that. And they probably always wanted to do it, but now they finally can ask for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, from my strange view from higher ed, we're seeing in some sectors people just deciding to leave higher ed altogether, which is easier than moving around within higher ed for a lot of people. But I think that there's a way in which some of our, like, you know, this is my life we are able to sort of see it from a different perspective. But it also makes me wonder about people who work in sectors for which there are not this high number of alternatives, and remote work is not available to them. Do you think that we're still seeing this kind of, you know, switching around, or is there is it more for like more high income, more highly educated, on average, more highly educated employees in more high income jobs, or is this shuffling also going on at other sectors? Do we know?
Yeah, I could jump in first. I mean, I don't have the statistics. I'm sure Kate might be able to bring different numbers here, but the hiring and the quitting has been felt across the, you know, broad industries. I think, you mean, it might look a little different as far as you mentioned, that the ability to work remotely is not an option, but across the board, you know, workers are needed. You know, definitely with COVID and health issues being an issue, there's always a lack, and there's always that risk of being affected, you know, negatively, or just being able to take advantage of an opportunity to move somewhere else. So that is still there. And I think it's still experienced across other fields.
Yeah, seconding that, I mean, that's what sort of the data is showing, is that, you know, the highest places to reach the highest quit rates are in jobs like leisure and hospitality jobs and retail jobs, which are in-person jobs. So people are shuffling around in these types of jobs. Hopefully, you know, we're also seeing that accompanied with wage growth and improved job quality, but people are shuffling around in those types of jobs.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the, you know, the amazing set of literature that was coming out about jobs and race and gender within the first year of COVID was really dark in terms of layoffs, in terms of COVID-related deaths for essential workers, women, white women, and Black and brown men and women workers were most likely to be in these extremely vulnerable positions. But yeah, now we see, you know, in some sense, the labor shortages that we see are the evidence of some of these some of these changes. And, you know, teachers and nurses and healthcare aides have long been so vulnerable in their workplace, and finally are able to do some kind of switching.
I mean, I will have like one optimistic note too. I mean, the decline in employment and the risk of employment, and some of these jobs, particularly like healthcare, which is a job that is disproportionately represented with Black women, particularly in jobs like nursing assistants. Those that we also did see some union activity in those sectors and some improvements. And so things like we know that unionized healthcare facilities had lower COVID rates because those workers were able to demand PPE. And so we know that there's this intersection of labor power, race and gender in different workplaces that have led to some positive outcomes for those workers where they've been able to exercise their power. So that was, I think, you know, I don't want to diminish the horrors of the pandemic and how it impacted people at work, but people being able to, you know, this being in that moment where you have to demand PPE and you have a union to back you up, and it actually was good for the workers and it was good for the workplaces, really demonstrates how important these institutions are to making sure jobs are quality jobs themselves and the services themselves are good jobs. It's really demonstrated, I think, some of those positive things.
Yeah.
So maybe even more. Oh, go ahead, Jason.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to also chime in the positive. I think we had to understand that the pandemic wasn't the only crisis that we were facing at the time. You know, we was also hit, you know, simultaneously with a, you know, race and gender equity fight that was really moving. And I think, you know, unfortunately, the positive in that is that it's giving labor the opportunity to really right some of the wrongs of its earlier days and be able to take stances that support race and gender equity. And so, and like Kate just mentioned, the national domestic workers are also really be able to organize home healthcare workers and in fields that might be neglected by labor. And so I think that's also another point, another positive kind of about this movement.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that Annie is here to tell us we should start taking questions from the floor.
Yes, that's right. And I actually have a question. Thinking about universal health care and what its impact might have on the worker. I know like Amazon, you know, touts that they give health benefits right off the bat, $15 an hour, in the hopes that that will prevent people from unionizing for rights. I'm just wondering what you're thinking about if we ever get universal health care, which is a ways away, but how, if we could take that off the table, you know, in terms of the employer keeping folks employed because they're afraid to leave because they could lose their health benefits. You know, this is a way to keep people quiet or, you know, or coming in. How do you think that could play in the future?
I love this question. I mean, I think there's this through line generally that having outside options is good for workers. So it could be an outside option for a job, but also not losing your work, those benefits that you need, or not losing income. And so I have a couple examples that there's research that shows in states that increase their Medicaid generosity. So maybe they went from, you know, they doubled the income threshold for access to Medicaid. So you had basically a public health insurance system for lower income workers, what happened was those workers are more likely to go into higher paid occupations. And so we know exactly that. We know that if we had universal healthcare, workers will shuffle around more, which is good. They'll go into higher paid occupations. They'll probably end up in occupations that they're going to be more productive in. And if they're more productive there, they'll contribute more to the economy overall. So we know that. I think that's like exactly right. The research backs up that having better access to healthcare that's not tied to your employer is good for those workers' economic outcomes and overall economic outcomes. And likewise, too, things like other income supports help workers maintain those outside options. So things like access to unemployment insurance helps people move into better jobs. Access to anti-poverty supports helps people move into better jobs. So just giving people that stability outside of work, whether it be healthcare or other income supports, is like really, it makes the economy more dynamic, and it's great for workers too.
Yeah, and just also a quick note to add. Yeah, quick note to add in there too. Also, it's important to add in paid sick leave, because on top of it, you shouldn't also be penalized for, especially nowadays, penalized for having to take off work because you're ill or potentially ill. Then now you have to choose between feeding your family or going getting medical care. And so I think a lot of things come with that as well, including healthcare. Sorry, excuse me, not healthcare, childcare that needs to be included in that, because just the health of yourself, the health of your family also can affect your ability to do your job and to work. And to, I think in the long run, it creates a much better work environment for everybody and more productivity. Just all the things that Kate just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Helen, welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'd like to report on a real life experience that I put a link to in the chat, which is the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. After several years of organizing and having one CBA with SEIU, the administration and their really actually vicious lawyer did not allow another contract for the adjunct union, as much as they tried to keep negotiating over the last few years. And also the staff started a union as well and then couldn't get a contract. So last month in February of 2022, both adjuncts and the staff shut the school down for a bounded strike for one whole week at the school. You can see all the images and got tons of press in a very positive way. So I'd like to call attention to how one of the most important sectors that seems to be organizing right now, of course, is higher ed among adjuncts. And this was a very positive outcome to date, because they went back to the bargaining table immediately after the strike and came up with their TAs. Can you tell everyone what that is? It's their, the contract. So now the adjuncts and the staff at the college are voting on that contract after many, many violations by the school. And hopefully everything is going to work out at least for the next year. And what's very exciting for everybody here is that the creative industries are really leading the way in terms of new labor, freshness, and union activity, especially among youth. And the young people who worked at this college really were the ones who set the standards for the strike and for working on the bargaining team. And that's true of museums, other schools, and other organizations, which includes the Independent Documentary Association in Los Angeles, which is now trying to unionize its very small workforce. So I just want to point that part out, because many of us are media makers, and they also are gaining momentum based on what happened with IATSE also in Los Angeles. So if y'all want any more information about how SEIU has been able to come in where no one else treads. Let me know, or look at that. Look at the amazing materials that are on that Instagram page.
Yeah. Thanks, Helen. Kate or Jason, any comments?
There has been a lot of higher ed organizing, and it's really great to see, especially adjuncts are paid, a horrifyingly low amount. But I think it's important to keep in mind too, that this is, I'm hoping will generate sort of a flurry of activity in your universities, because universities is not all just PhD workers. There are workers at all different job classes and education levels and pay levels. So, my anecdote that I will also share is one of my good friends is an organizer at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she's a librarian, but what they're trying to do there is have a staff union that includes professional staff like her, where she's a librarian with multiple graduate degrees, alongside the security staff, alongside the janitorial staff in the same bargaining unit. And they have a lot of support from students as well in trying to make sure that those benefits and rights that we're giving to the educated staff in universities is extended to all the staff in universities.
Yeah, I want to point out that at CCA, it included all levels of staff, not just the professional staff. And because of the success, the faculty themselves are also looking into joining the union.
It's great.
So yeah, it cuts across all sectors.
Yeah. Thanks, Helen. I think that that's also a good piece of evidence, kind of like what you were talking about, Kate, about how proximity and experience and, inspires other people to join or to start thinking about it. And SEIU has really gone out of its way to go into lots of different sectors. Patty, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for such a interesting panel. And I was so happy to see Helen D. Michelle coming to us from San Francisco. And she is actually teaches at California College of the Arts. So she's deep involved in this struggle. And I'm so glad that you shared that, Helen. My question is about the gig economy. I was talking to someone who's an economist in Washington, D.C., and I asked her, how are you thinking about the Great Resignation? And she said, I think it's a great gray economy right now. And she pointed out to me that every year, the numbers of people in the gig economy or the freelance economy or the outsourced economy, or what colleges like to tell students, become an entrepreneur economy, are increasing. And like Helen, I'm in media, and I look at media jobs sometimes with great horror, because unless you're an executive, they're not full-time, they don't have health insurance, you wait for someone to call you, and if you're lucky, you work a couple times a year. And in fact, our third speaker couldn't come because he's in the gig economy, even though he was the camera operator for Steven Spielberg's West Side Story. He had to take the job he had. So I'd like to understand from you three, as economists who track this, where does the gig economy fit in, and this sort of casualization of labor and outsourcing, and how does it figure? Because to me, it's hard to unionize people who are freelancers hired by the job, but maybe I don't know as much as you. Thank you.
I'll take the first part, and then Jason, you probably know more about organizing workers, but it's actually pretty mixed evidence. And when you think of a traditional independent contractor, it's about 10% of the workforce, and it does not seem to have risen substantially over the past 20 years or so based on how you measure it. That being said, I think, you talked about subcontracting. I think that's where we've seen a rise in some precarious labor. Is again my example of, like, there's the janitorial services company that I used to work at the union for. They were employed as a subcontractor of whoever rented that office space, and that office space was then rented out by the real estate company. And so there's these complicated employment relationships that do make it hard to organize workers, because their direct employer may not actually have much power in that whole relationship. The person who has the power is like 3 companies above that one. So it's kind of hard to make huge wage demands if you can't actually be talking to the folks who are in power. But the rise of independent contractors, like I think statistically is somewhat overstated, but I think these complicated employment relationships, or what's called fissured work in the economics literature, have risen and do make it hard to organize. But what are the actual challenges of organizing those workers, Jason?
Yes, as you mentioned, it's really hard to it's a slippery group that you can just fire and hire at will. I think some of the tactics and methods to really fight this is a lot of times local legislation. Propositions. Fortunately lost the fight of the Prop 22 fight in Southern California, and that that was difficult. But that's a way to really fight this thing, and also in some of the government contracts, like Kate just mentioned, the person who's actually hiring is like 3 companies removed, subcontract to hire someone else, and so they don't have the requirements to follow, like have certain health care benefits, certain health and safety concerns. And so having those built into the contracts that can transfer down to subcontractors is another way to be able to kind of avoid or preemptively fight against some of this gig economy. I think also new methods of organizing really would connect to the workers. City of Austin did something, kind of created a new a rideshare platform that really allows for better care, better benefits for their drivers. That I think is just a different way to really approach the situation. And I mean, and the gig economy is itself a kind of an out of the box, idea about what working is. And so I think you need another out of the box idea of how to organize these workers. That's, I think, still being developed.
Julian, question?
Hi. I mean, I had a separate question, but just one comment that I wanted to make about that is I'm currently making a film about delivery workers in New York City, largely sort of migrant delivery workers. And one of the things that I've seen sort of in the filmmaking process is that they've been engaging in what's now referred to as like alt labor. So the creation of sort of organizations that are pushing to petition things. And what I've seen is that I think in certain ways it's somewhat palliative is definitely the wrong word because they're getting huge reforms done, but it's not the same thing as a union. And I wanted to sort of I just wanted to point out that alt labor sort of thing is coming out, but I'm not fully sure where I stand on it. Separately to that though,
Wait, Julian, I'm interested in this point, so I want to hear what your other question is, but Kate or Jason, do you want to respond to this alt labor idea?
I think that's a little bit of what you're
Sounds really
talking
interesting.
I feel like that's a little bit what you're talking about, Jason, of like thinking outside the box.
Yeah, sorry, my internet's going out. I'm having trouble hearing the question, but it sounds like, you think about a different approach to really organizing, which I completely agree. I think that's what's necessary to really fight this kind of gig economy.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Julian. If you're
yeah. So the separate question I have, and I'm going to speak slowly so everyone with internet issues can hear me, is sort of about the historical use of sort of so one of a thesis that I've seen promulgated a lot in sort of academic discourse and stuff, and one that I generally agree with, but I'm not fully sure on, is that during Reconstruction in certain eras, a lot of like modern basically race dialogue and race issues were used by sort of white supremacists and so forth in many different areas to basically create a cudgel between white and POC sort of working class groups and organization. And I sort of wanted to hear a little bit about that, and I wanted to hear a little bit about whether you guys think that that's still something that's going on, if that's an issue. So thanks.
Jason, do you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize. I dropped off there. I got the second half of it. Yeah, after the Reconstruction period in 1415, the 16th Amendment that came out, I think it was a brief period of prosperity for Black workers, and kind of the retaliation after that is, the Jim Crow era laws, and that really, like you mentioned, that to divide the working people, and really to attack Black workers and separate workers of color, and oppress them. I think, part of the work we're doing now is really trying to realize some of those promises made from those amendments that came out. I think, a lot of the issues that we're fighting is really, rooted in white supremacy, and they rose from that time. I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question. Like I said, I missed part of it, but I agree with you that, a lot of some of the issues really did start right after that Reconstruction period.
Yeah, I will add, I will drop another paper. I know I'm dropping a lot of economics papers, which may not be accessible to most people, but I love this paper where this PhD candidate in economics looks at the text the Republicans used in their speeches in the early 20th century to the late 20th century to look at sort of explicitly the ways in which racist dog whistles were tied to economic policy issues. And it used to be super explicit, horrifying stuff. They're still doing that. They're just using different dog whistles now, or maybe dog whistles that are not as overt as they were, but they are still racially coded language used in economic policy rhetoric in a really explicit way. So I think that is something that has changed but persisted. So I think that is exactly right. But advocates and researchers like me try to sort of do this narrative building work, both through research that demonstrates that racial equity is good for the overall economy, to try to build solidarity, and then really, deep thinking about how you create a I think it's called one example I've seen is called the race class narrative, to try to really be able to create that solidarity across race.
Thanks, Julian. That was really a great question. Rachel?
Hi. So I have a question that might be maybe kind of simple, but I was just wondering if you could identify a successful strike in US history, at anything that comes to mind, and what specifically about that strike made it successful? What were elements of that made it work?
I have one very old example that the union I used to work for had a strike. I want to say it was in late 1945 or 1946, where all the janitorial services in New York City went on strike, and people wouldn't cross the picket line, so nobody went to work. I don't think we're going to live in that world anymore, but literally because it was the people were picketing in front of the buildings they worked in, nobody went to their office jobs. I don't know if we have that anymore, because I don't think people, we were working remotely, and people don't have the same acknowledgement of crossing picket lines, or they don't know if there's a strike going on in the company that they're getting services or products from. But that strike, I will try to find information on it and drop. But that was an example. I think it sort of requires not only the workers withdrawing their labor, but solidarity from the community around them to support them, to really have a company feel the pain there.
My favorite examples is the Atlanta washerwoman strike. One, I love it because one, it was really, it's Black women led, which was, even for today's time, much less to that time, is really, it's exceptional. And I think, it's not what we think of when we think of a labor strike. And so I think it was really, it was significant, and it meant a lot. The washerwomen's strike in 1881.
And what were the labor related outcomes?
I was trying to remember all the what it kind of led to. I just remember that it was a group of 20 women who, laundresses who got together, and 20 Black women who really, who I guess who boycotted. And so I just, I don't have all the details. I was trying to remember it.
Yeah.
I have to go do my research and give some exact, but that was one that stood out that I love the story.
Yeah, I want to reiterate, I know these are higher ed examples, but the example that Helen brought up a little while ago, and also a couple of years before COVID, at Ithaca College, part-time adjunct workers and people on one-year contracts organized for joining a union, also with the help of SEIU, and they did eventually vote over 75% to join the union. And then after a year of difficult negotiations, they got actual wage increases for the first time in many, many, many years that are now in a bargaining agreement that make it raise the wages for part-time workers in a really substantial way and in a stepwise way over the course of years, many years. And they also changed, the sort of requirements around professional development for part-time workers. And also, I will say that, some of these gains can be lost very quickly when organizations take on austerity measures. So especially for precarious workers that engage in union activity, it's very good, but it doesn't, without, sort of more secure contracts in general, more permanent contracts in general, a lot of that work can kind of go away if the people, if those contracts are not, more stable. So anyway, it was a great success. But because of some austerity, there's a lot fewer part-timers. Phil, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. It was wonderful, Kate, that you brought up 45, 46. The whole disruption of World War II led to some very strong labor activity. And I'm wondering whether the disruption of COVID, now the disruption of the war in Ukraine, are there opportunities for us to make some headways? 45 and 46 for the steelworkers strike led to Taft-Hartley and the rights that we have underneath that. And it's like, I'm just wondering if the disruption of the past 2 years, 3 years has really caused an opportunity for unionization.
I mean, I think we've seen a little bit of that labor activity in the past couple of years, particularly, I think, again, I'm going to point to solidarity as being a really critical issue too, because I think we saw that in the pandemic. I think it was a time where people recognized that our healthcare workers should have PPE. People recognized that teachers, should have safe working conditions, things like that. I do think it was so extreme, and because it impacted so many people, and I think probably the World War II was like that, it impacted everyone. No one was unaware of World War II. No one was unaware of COVID. And so I think it allowed people to maybe foster some more solidarity with workers who were facing risks in the workplace. So I think we did see that. The question for me is how much we can bake in those gains that have been made or keep that momentum going in absence of institutional supports like labor law reform or a functioning National Labor Relations Board that can maintain those gains.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think policy, national policy, specifically like with these oversight boards, is important to really be able to cement these gains. And unfortunately, I mean, while there was this common struggle that's similar to in 45, 46, we always have a deep division politically, which I think is kind of different compared to that time. And so I think that is the backlash and the pushback is a lot stronger. So I think that kind of leaves it up in the air. My optimism is kind of waning to see if we can have similar results. But we still do this work.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, I think it's time for us to consider if we have any closing thoughts. We kind of did just have perhaps a question along those lines, but if there's any last nugget either of you want to close with.
I will try to be brief when I head off to Jason. I feel like I keep talking first. I apologize. I think I'm just like a little bit excitable right now about talking about this stuff. I'm talking to a new group of people, which is really fun for me. Not talking to academics. Anyway, I'm very excited to be here. I think there's like, lots of causes for optimism, but also, and I think Jason has brought this up a lot, that like we need to keep in mind the folks who are not sharing in the gains we're making right now. And particularly things like he talked about the reports of research and like digging into different people's experiences and not just aggregating the experience of a low wage worker, but really looking at our Black women gaining. So that's the one thing I've been looking at a lot in my work, is that Black women's employment is still really suppressed. They lost the most jobs in the pandemic, and they have not gained they've gained some back, but other people have recovered their employment levels and Black women have not. So there's, the labor market is pretty strong right now. It's pretty tight. There's a lot of opportunity, but we really need to leverage that to keep a focus on the folks who have not been able to share in those gains, and both have activism and policy and research that helps us understand how to make an economy that really does work for everyone.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah, Kate, and trust me, I appreciate you jumping first. I need time to gather my words, and so speaking is not my choice, activity, and so I am grateful, for your eagerness. But my closing remarks, really, I'll keep it brief as well. I think the key word is solidarity. I think solidarity in this time where flexibility and the ability to be able to quit is now a power that we're regaining. I think be able to move collectively is our greatest strength. Using solidarity to uplift Black women, to support those who are oppressed based on their race or their gender or their identity. I think a shared education, or education to really to inform individuals about really what their rights are, what is a good working job, what does it mean to be an essential worker, quote unquote. I think that's what's necessary to us to be able to really really move forward and to really collectively thrive. And so when our work is really focusing on Black leadership, because we feel like that if the most oppressed are able to rise up, then everyone will be able to rise up, and everyone will be able to prosper in those kind of ways. I think we need to redefine what economic democracy means, and also be able to change what the socioeconomic conditions are in this country. I think solidarity, education is really what's key to be able to move forward.
It's really inspiring, both of you, to end on this note about solidarity. And it's really, I agree, like the way that Kate had said it before, that in a way, like we have through this pandemic sort of had a glimpse at solidarity that we haven't had before, because of it is such a striking experience. But we really do need to leverage it and to learn and to know more about what we can do for each other for it to be an inclusive economy. I mean, we both as economists, but as activists, as consumers, as workers. And it sounds like the experience that Helen was talking about and that Kate are talking about in terms of like in higher ed, thinking not about like, what is your status in your job and unionizing horizontally like that, but thinking about the power that we have vertically across our industries is definitely, where things really are. And consumers have powers too, to uplift and promote, even in these kind of organizing ways to, to elevate information and to support one another. I think it's amazing. I am so grateful that the two of you answered my call like a month ago to join us tonight. And we have some reasons to be optimistic, but we also have a lot of work to do. But thanks for the inspiration.
And thank you for what a fantastic panel. This was really interesting. I learned so much. In a couple of minutes, our staff is going to put a PDF into the chat that is going to encapsulate all of the links that everybody made throughout the evening. So please make sure that you grab that as soon as we get that up there. And right now, I invite everybody to go to the gallery view, turn on your cameras, and turn on your microphones so that we can give a big round of applause for our fantastic panel. Thank you all so much. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming.
There isn't one. There's the chat.
I'm now looking at the chat. Thank you to the producers for putting all that information in the chat. Oh, I think we lost Kate. It's okay.
Is this a talk back or an end of the meeting discussion? Like a recap?
This is not a talk back.
Julian, thanks for coming. This is just for the
Julian, thank you. Great to see you.
Yeah, and great question, Julian. We really appreciate
Yes.
it.
Am I staying for this or not? Because I am part of the.
no thanks. We don't not right now. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry we lost Kate. Oh gee.
Yeah, I think she
We
might
didn't
have.
say anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to log off myself.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jason. I thought I maybe I didn't make that clear. You were great. She was great. This was a great session. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I think, no, Kate